In 1993, a bride vanished between photographs. Her bouquet stayed on the table. Her veil was folded in the dressing room. Her heels were gone. No scream, no crash, no goodbye. Some said she ran. Some said she was taken. No one ever found her. But 31 years later, a pair of white heels appeared, laced together, swinging from a tree behind the venue, clean, quiet, and too new to have waited there alone. The shoes weren't tossed, they were placed, ankles laced together in a perfect loop, tied at the center with satin ribbon that hadn't rotted or frayed, hanging from a tree that sat just beyond the gravel lot where the original reception tent once stood. The shoes didn't match the dirt. They didn't match the wind. They looked curated, not old, not new, just preserved, like they had been waiting in a drawer somewhere far away from mold and air and time. When the landscaper saw them swaying low near his eye line, he assumed it was a prank, something left by teenagers. But when he reached out to grab them, his hand slowed. He said later that something about the way the knot was tied didn't feel accidental. It wasn't looped for fun. It wasn't forgotten laundry or fabric caught on bark. It felt ceremonial. He called the property manager. The manager called local law enforcement. And by the time the shoes were removed, gloved hands holding them like evidence from a museum, the story had already started to unbury itself. The venue had changed names twice. It was no longer a wedding location. It held art fairs and summer fundraisers, but not vows. The old bridal suite had been converted into storage. The oak grove behind the property, where couples once took golden hour portraits in the trees, was now mostly wild again, except for that one tree, tall, heavy-branched, roots pressed into a slope that hadn't shifted in 3 decades. Beneath the shoes, the soil looked soft, not disturbed in a violent way, just pressed, shaped, a small mound, maybe a foot wide. Cadaver dogs were called, but it wasn't scent that led to the discovery. It was the metal pin, a brooch fastener pressed inside cloth. The lace wasn't white anymore. It was cream, dirt-stained, stiff, but folded, cleanly. Someone had removed the dress, not ripped it, had folded it, not stuffed it, had placed it beneath the tree like a blanket beneath a relic, and the fabric was tested. The hemline matched the designer's 1993 run. The tiny row of pearl buttons matched the photos taken that day. A torn stitch near the base aligned with the thread seen curling up in her final solo frame. It was hers, not a copy, not a similar dress. Her dress, and it hadn't been in the woods for 31 years. The internal seams were dry, no signs of long-term exposure to moisture or insects. Someone had kept it somewhere safe. Someone had returned it, not to hide it, to show it. The shoes confirmed it. Forensic analysis found no signs of decay along the sole threading. The leather was old, yes, but recently cleaned. A small stain on the toe, pink lipstick, was found to match a discontinued shade she'd worn that day. The shoes had been worn once, then stored, then placed, and placed with care. Because whoever returned to the venue in 2024 didn't dig, didn't rush. They walked the exact path she had walked after her photo. They stood beneath the trees, 31 years later, and knew exactly where to go. They knew the tree had grown. They knew the sun would fall through it at the same angle. They knew someone would eventually see it. Not soon, not immediately, but soon enough. And when they did, the old stories would come back. The photo, the table, the untouched bouquet, the dress gone, the veil still folded, the guests slowly realizing something was wrong. It was one of those weddings where everything felt too quiet. No arguments, no rushing. The photos were on time. The DJ was early. The speeches were short. People described the bride as calm, not happy, not beaming, just soft, slow, like she was floating a half inch above the floor. The last time anyone remembered seeing her face was at the start of the photo session, when the photographer told her to hold her bouquet with both hands and stand slightly apart from the groom for a solo shot. The guests had gone back inside. The lighting was perfect. She had turned her head back toward the hall, smiled slightly, and the shutter clicked. Then the photographer adjusted his lens. The groom stepped aside to grab water, and she walked out of frame into the trees. Not fast, not scared, just walking. And when they looked back, she was gone. No trail, no scream, no footsteps. Like someone had told her where to go, like she'd already rehearsed it. The staff assumed she'd gone to the suite. The groom thought she'd gotten overwhelmed, but when 10 minutes turned to 20 and her makeup artist found the veil still sitting folded on the bench, untouched, everything slowed. Her purse was still there. Her lipstick, her phone, everything. The dress was gone. The shoes were gone. The person inside the photographs was gone. And now, 31 years later, the objects had returned, not scattered, not broken, but positioned, not as memory, as message, because whoever placed those shoes wanted them seen, and not just by anyone, by someone who remembered how she stood, how she folded her hands over the bouquet, how she smiled just slightly before stepping into the trees. Someone who knew the frame so well they could reconstruct it, not digitally, physically, with satin and lace, and the long shadow of a tree that had been waiting to speak. The case wasn't reopened, not formally. No charges, no suspects, no body. And without a body, there was nothing to exhume, nothing to process, nothing to prosecute. But the sheriff's department kept the shoes. They kept the dress. They filed the report under suspicious discovery of personal effects, and they called the former detective who had worked the scene in 1993. He came out of retirement to see them with his own eyes, and when he did, his hands didn't move for almost a minute. He just stared at the shoes, then the fabric, then the knot in the lace. He didn't say the word staged, not at first. He said arranged, like a table setting, like a photo shoot. The way the dress had been folded wasn't casual, it wasn't crumpled. Someone had creased the edges, tucked the sleeves in, pulled the fabric beneath itself like a shroud. There were no bugs inside, no plant rot, no evidence it had been exposed for long. Someone had carried it, protected it, and then placed it, and not just anywhere. That tree, the one behind the lot, had been trimmed every season until the property changed hands in 2017. After that, no one touched it. The new owner let the grove grow wild, meaning the tree had been undisturbed for 7 years before the shoes appeared, and whoever placed them knew that. They knew when the cameras were gone, when the lights were off, when no one was watching. Someone had waited for the exact right moment to return, and it wasn't for closure, it was for memory. When forensic teams scanned the branch, they found something else. Not on the bark, but embedded in the knot. A small thread. Not satin, cotton, pale blue. It looked like a ribbon, the kind used in garters. Only it wasn't part of the shoes. It had been knotted around the lace, then cut. Not frayed. Sliced. Like someone had tied it there, then trimmed it away at the last second. And tucked inside the knot, pressed tight against the laces, was something even stranger. A pin not decorative, industrial. Small, rusted, used in upholstery. The kind found in old venue furniture. It was bent slightly as if it had been stepped on once, then carried, and that detail changed everything, because it meant someone had gone back inside. Not recently, not this year, but once, long ago, someone had taken a pin from the venue, kept it with the shoes, kept it with the dress, kept all of it long enough for the rust to deepen, for the cotton to fade, for the objects to feel like relics. Then they returned them, not hidden, not burned, not abandoned, returned. And this wasn't the first time someone had tried. There had been a call in 2008. Anonymous. Male. Said he had something to bring in, said he couldn't live with it anymore. The dispatcher tried to trace it, but the call cut off. No follow-up. No ID. Then in 2011, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. No return address. Just 4 words, typed on a card and tucked into a blank envelope. It read, "The shoes were mine." The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, childlike. The stamp was pre-2000, meaning it had sat somewhere, unused for almost a decade before being mailed. The card was tested. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA, nothing. And so the folder grew. Old clues with no shape, old phrases with no meaning, until now, until the laces returned. Until the shoes swayed in the wind just long enough for a tree trimmer to stop mid-cut and see them. And now the shape was forming. Not of a killer, not of a suspect, of a routine, a rhythm. Someone was trying to rebuild something, not a body, a moment, a corridor of objects, bouquet, veil, shoes, dress, pins, light, angle, and the final piece, the photo, the last frame before she disappeared. The photographer had kept the negative. He had left the industry years ago, moved north, opened a small bakery. He said he still remembered the weight in his chest the second she didn't return from the trees. How quiet it had gotten, how the DJ didn't want to keep playing. How the sun hit the garden wall too perfectly, like it was waiting for someone to walk back into the shot. He gave them the photo, the original, not the printout, the negative. And when it was scanned under new forensic lenses, they found something he never saw, not in the foreground, not in the bride, behind her, deep in the trees, a shape, not human, not clear, just wrong, like a double exposure that didn't belong, like a shadow that didn't follow the light. It looked like part of the woods, a split in the bark, but it was too round, too smooth, like a face not watching her, facing away, like something standing still, waiting for her to arrive. The techs ran enhancement filters, nothing conclusive, but they all agreed the shadow wasn't in any other photo, not before, not after, just the one, the last one. And when they traced the angle of the sun, the position of the camera, the arc of the trees, they realized something else. The bride's eyes, in that frame, weren't looking back at the photographer. They weren't looking toward the hall. They were looking at the shadow. Not scared, not curious, just aware. Like she'd seen it before, like she'd expected it. And maybe that's why she smiled. The photo was reprinted on high-resolution matte paper, mounted and placed at the center of the investigation board, not because it showed her they had dozens of images of her, but because it showed that one impossible thing behind her, the dark shape in the trees, faint, recessed, grainy, but undeniably there. And in every close-up, in every angle, in every light test, the outline stayed the same, tall, narrow, head slightly bowed, like someone standing with their back turned, too clean to be a broken trunk, too soft to be a trick of shadow. And when you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. It didn't move. It didn't reach. It just waited, like it had always been there, like it knew the timing better than anyone else. And the more they looked at it, the more everything started to align. The missing timeline, the bouquet on the table, the dress vanished without a wrinkle, the way no one saw anything happen, and worst of all, how no one heard a sound, not a rustle, not a scream, not even the weight of footsteps on the grass. It was as if the moment had been rehearsed and she had followed it without resistance. Not abducted, not chased, not confused, just guided. And the idea crept in like a draft. What if someone didn't take her? What if she went, not on her own, not by plan, but by pattern? And that's when the detective started reviewing the layout of the venue, not just the map, the construction plans, Blueprints from the 1970s, aerial footage. He traced the path she had walked after the photograph, not where people had searched, where her body would have gone if she kept moving. 27 feet from the photo's capture point, the path curved into a slope. Past that, a slight drop into a narrow wooded passage, not enough to fall, enough to disappear. And 31 years ago, that trail wasn't marked. It was only cleared to make room for a potential expansion that never happened, meaning she might have walked into it naturally without even knowing it. And just beyond that slope, according to 1993 soil records, was a hollow space. Not a building, not a tunnel, just an indentation in the ground, almost perfectly oval, 10 feet long and dry-packed with stone. The locals called it the Sunken Patch. Teenagers used to drink there. Then they stopped. By 2000, the trees covered it again. It vanished from maps, but the records kept it. And when a search team hiked out that way in 2024, following the slope behind the tree, they found it. Not hidden, just covered. Soft moss, uneven dirt, and when it was cleared, they saw it had been lined with something. Not stone, wood, planks, curved, bent in a semi-arc. Like a broken wall, not high, barely 2 feet, but too deliberate to be natural. And pressed into the side of one of the boards, almost completely eroded, was the remnant of a nail. Not modern, hand-forged, and something scratched into the wood, not carved, pressed, like letters, but backward. Someone had written into the other side, from the inside, and what they wrote was short, just 4 letters, not her name, not a date. It said, "Stay." And suddenly the photo wasn't just a clue, it was a map. And the shoes weren't just a message, they were the first marker. The dress, the pin, the fabric, all of it followed a trail someone had been trying to reopen, piece by piece. Not for guilt, not for discovery, for memory. They weren't leading investigators to the truth, they were leading them back through it. And the shape in the photo, the shadow in the trees, was the one thing that hadn't changed. The one thing that knew where the slope turned. The one thing that might still be there. When they scanned the soil in the hollow, nothing organic appeared. No bones, no remains, just that wall, and beyond it the start of another path. One not on any blueprint, not on any map. A trail so thin it barely held shape. But when they followed it, 20 yards in, they found another object. Small, half buried in moss, metal, a clasp, bridal style, and beneath it, more lace. Not a dress, a ribbon, the kind used to tie the base of a bouquet. It matched the floral wrap used in her arrangements that day, identical thread pattern, and that meant it had been placed after the photo, because the bouquet itself had been left on the table. This was a second wrap, a second ribbon, another copy, another cue, and the detective finally said what no one wanted to hear. This is not where she was taken. This is where she was brought. Because the timing didn't make sense. The silence didn't make sense. The way the trail aligned with the camera angle, with the light, with the placement of the shoes, it was too clean. It was too rehearsed. Like someone had drawn a line through the forest and waited 3 decades to walk it again. Not to remember her, to follow her. And now, for the first time, the case wasn't about who took the bride. It was about where she went and what waited there, already facing away. The trail that began behind the sunken patch was almost too narrow to follow, a thin seam in the underbrush where the moss grew lighter and the roots bent slightly to one side, as if they had once been pressed down by regular foot traffic that hadn't returned in years. No signs of animals, no scarring from erosion or tire tracks or boots, just a line softened by time, but still there, like a memory that didn't know how to fade. The forensics team moved slowly, not just to preserve evidence, but because there was something about the air along that path that made people quiet, not heavy, not thick, just slow, like walking through something that had already decided what you were going to find. They followed the line of moss for almost 50 yards, deeper into the woods, the venue now fully out of view, the road too far to hear, the birds silent. Then they found the next object. Not hidden, not buried, placed. A folded strip of white cloth tucked against the base of a hollow tree, shaped like a ribbon but too wide to be decorative. It was a sash, silk, bridal, the kind worn across the waist to cinch the bodice of a gown. It matched the make of the dress found under the tree. The fibers aligned, the stitching identical. It had been removed, pressed flat, folded 3 times, and laid like a bookmark against the base of the trunk. Next to it, a pin. Not the brooch pin from earlier, a corsage pin, bent at the middle, almost snapped, with a pearl head now yellowed from age, the kind used to hold flowers in place, and beneath the pin, half pressed into the soft rot at the base of the tree, was a petal, dry, papery, but intact, pale pink peony, the same flower used in her bouquet. The samples were collected, tested, the cloth was confirmed as original. The pin was from the same bridal kit the florist used in 1993. The petal was real, not plastic, not a replica, and this was the part that disturbed everyone the most. It hadn't been there for 31 years. It had been placed recently, not last week, but not decades ago either. Moisture damage suggested a time frame of 6 to 9 months, meaning someone had carried the sash, the pin, the petal, or collected them and walked that path, following the seam of moss, knowing exactly where to stop. And it wasn't random. The hollow tree they were left beside had been marked, not visibly, not obviously, but just inside the opening, beneath the curve of the wood, a small strip of black tape had been pressed into the bark, almost invisible in the dark, but new, clean, and under that tape, written in faded blue ink, a word, not carved, handwritten, pressed lightly on paper, then covered. The word was stay. Same as the scratched plank found at the sunken patch, and it raised the question again. Who was being asked to stay? The bride, or whoever kept leaving these pieces, because the pattern had shifted, the shoes, the dress. Those were acts of return, artifacts brought back, signals to draw someone in. But now the path wasn't looping. It was stretching forward into places no one had walked publicly since before the venue was built. The landscape maps showed nothing ahead. No marked sites, no structures, just a slope, a dry creek bed, and an old perimeter wall from before the property had been subdivided in the 1950s. But when the team reached the creek bed, dry now, lined with stone, they found something else. A photo, not old, not folded, recent, placed under a rock, still flat, protected from wind, printed on cheap paper, color slightly desaturated. And in the photo, a bench, wooden, worn, sitting beneath a willow tree that wasn't on any part of the property. In the photo, the bench was empty, but there was something familiar about the curve of the tree behind it, the way it bent, the way the shadows split across the grass. And that's when one of the team members realized what it was. They had seen that shape before, not on the map, not in person. In the final photo, the one of the bride turning away. Behind her, in the far right corner, blurred and hidden behind the garden wall, a small tree curved leftward toward the sun, and beneath it, barely visible, a bench. Not the same angle, not the same lighting, but unmistakable. It had been there all along, and someone had gone back to it, taken a photo, printed it, left it, and now they were building the route in reverse, from shoes to dress to path to bench. The team followed the creek bed, The air changed again. Colder, not from weather, from shape. The trees grew closer. The light broke less. The moss grew over the rocks instead of around them. And 20 feet past the last photo drop, they found the bench real. Wood grayed with time, slumped slightly to one side, vines curled around one leg, but still standing, and beneath the bench, pressed between two slats of wood, folded twice, a piece of paper, thicker than the photo, glossier. They opened it. It was a printout of her, the bride, the same final photo, slightly cropped, darker exposure, her head turned, her eyes soft and drawn in ink over her body, small looping lines, not random, not scribbles, tracing the curve of her arms, her shoulder, her back, arrows, pointing outward, away from her, toward the trees, like someone had been mapping her posture, following her line of movement, and across the bottom of the paper, printed in faint red letters, not typed, not handwritten, the phrase, "Do not turn around." And for the first time, one of the investigators stepped back, not out of fear, out of recognition, because they had heard that phrase before, not in a briefing, not in a case, in a letter. The anonymous card sent in 2011, the one that said the shoes were mine, had included a second line blurred from water damage, never deciphered, but under infrared scan one of the texts had guessed it might say, "You mustn't turn." And now it was clear, not a warning, an instruction, a rule, part of a ritual someone had been following or enforcing or writing as they went. And suddenly the bench wasn't just a memory spot, it was a checkpoint. And they hadn't been walking into a crime scene, they had been walking into a pattern, and somewhere ahead of them, it wasn't finished yet. The phrase "do not turn around" wasn't just written on the printout beneath the bench. It was echoed, repeated, again and again, 7 times total small, faint in the margins, drawn at slight angles, as if someone had been tracing it idly with their hand while watching something unfold. And the ink, faint red, wasn't ink at all. It was dried pigment, flour-based. Lab results confirmed it came from crushed peony petals, ground and mixed with alcohol. Whoever wrote it had used her wedding flowers as pigment, not just as a symbol, as a medium, which meant they weren't leaving behind mementos anymore. They were leaving artifacts of the event, built with parts of the day, the shoes, the dress, the sash, the pin, the flower. And now, the ink and the paper, when tested, showed a watermark that predated 1995. No printer marks, no pixelation, developed photograph, not digital, meaning someone had kept a copy of the original image for over 30 years, altered it by hand, then returned to this trail and placed it beneath the bench, folded cleanly, twice, with creases aligned. Not sloppy, not impulsive, deliberate. And when the team looked up from that bench, past the overgrowth and the tilted trees, the trail did not disappear. It narrowed, curved left, dipped once, then straightened. It wasn't natural anymore. It was designed. And the further they followed it, the more intentional it began to feel. 10 yards ahead, the trees opened slightly into a clearing no larger than a living room. Not wide, not circular, just rectangular enough to feel arranged. The ground had been swept recently, not with a broom, with cloth. Soft drag marks in the dirt, no boot imprints, no twigs or leaves, as if someone had patted their steps. And at the center of the clearing, not buried, not hidden, a stool, wooden, low to the ground, paint faded gray, 3 legs, one reinforced with wire. It didn't belong to the venue. It didn't match any inventory. It wasn't on record. And the wood, when tested, matched material used in the late 80s, likely a personal item, old, repaired, cared for, and placed in the center like a marker, a seat, or a stage. And on top of the stool, a cloth, square, linen, bridal white, though faded and stained slightly yellow at the corners, folded into a perfect square, 12 inches by 12, pinned to the top of it, a hair comb, plastic, white, a few strands still caught in the teeth. Long, light brown, human. DNA analysis would confirm it matched her brush, her family line, her wedding day style. It was hers. The comb had been pulled from her hair after the ceremony, likely in the dressing room. And yet here it was, 3 decades later, folded inside cloth, placed gently atop a stool in the middle of a silent clearing, with nothing around it but trees and the sound of shifting air. And the question returned again. How did someone carry this much memory for so long? How did they protect it, preserve it, maintain its meaning through 31 years of silence? And what made them decide now was the time to rebuild it? Because that's what it was. Not a clue, not a confession, a reconstruction, an attempt to reset the timeline, to walk it again, but with no camera, no crowd, no vows, just the pieces that had gone missing. And behind the stool, pressed flat into the dirt like a fallen handkerchief, the next object appeared. A strip of tulle, wedding veil material, sheer, brittle with time, not the veil from her suite, not the one left folded. This was a second piece, trimmed roughly along one edge. When examined closely, it showed tiny holes along the top, pin marks, as if it had once been affixed to a stand, a frame, or a comb. Not worn, displayed. And along the lower edge, something written, embroidered by hand in fine thread, loose cursive, fraying in places. 3 words, stay in frame. And that confirmed what they feared. This wasn't about murder, or revenge, or fear. It was about the image, the moment, the ritual of how she left. Because the phrase "do not turn around" wasn't about her escape, it was about her placement. And stay in frame didn't mean remain present. It meant hold still, don't ruin the picture. And for the first time, the investigation began to tilt. Not toward crime, but toward performance. Someone had orchestrated this, not once. Not on the day she vanished, across years, piece by piece. And they hadn't just saved her items, they had studied her posture, traced her movement, copied the shape of her turn, and now they were setting the scene again, not to relive it, to control it, because a mile back, inside the photo, she had walked out of frame. Now, someone was trying to walk her back in, but not with her, with the outline of her, the shell, the trace, and whatever it was leading. Toward it hadn't happened yet. The final part of the clearing revealed a ring of small stones pressed into the dirt around the stool, 12 in total, placed equidistantly. Inside each stone, someone had carved a mark, not a symbol, not a name, a letter, and when written clockwise, beginning from the base of the stool, they spelled Donut Turna. Only 10 letters, the final 2 stones were blank, as if waiting, and a measurement revealed the disturbing part. The spacing of the ring matched the shape of a bridal train, 4 feet back, 3 feet wide, 12 points, like someone had measured where her dress had fallen, and now they were putting it back, letter by letter, layer by layer, not telling the story, building it again, and the last 2 blank stones weren't a mistake. They were a signal that whoever was leaving these pieces wasn't done. And the worst part, they might be close. The stones didn't get touched. No one stepped inside the ring. The techs held the perimeter like they were guarding a gravesite, but it didn't feel like a burial. It felt like a warning. And not because it was sharp or threatening or dangerous in any way. It felt like something fragile had been left there. Not to protect others from it, but to protect it from others. Like whoever had placed the stones didn't want the ritual interrupted. Not the items, the shape. because everything so far had followed a curve. From the shoes, to the folded dress, to the trail through the woods, to the bench and the stool, and now this. Each moment marking the last known position of the bride, like a performance being reconstructed for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. And that idea started to haunt the lead investigator the longer she stared at the empty stool, because it meant that this wasn't a message sent backward. It wasn't meant to explain what happened. It was a prompt, a trigger. It was meant to restart something, and if it was being restarted, that meant whoever placed the objects wasn't finished, and maybe never would be. The team spent 6 hours photographing, preserving, and scanning the clearing. Nothing else was found. No footprints, no DNA, no hair, no sweat, no traces of food or fire or shelter, nothing that would suggest someone had stayed there long. But one object was found further back, behind a tree just past the stone ring. Not on the ground, hanging, a ribbon, white silk, torn on one edge, knotted to a nail driven into the bark of the tree. The nail was rusted, bent, not part of the trunk. It had been placed there at an earlier time, likely years ago, then reused, and the ribbon wasn't like the others. This one had no lace, no writing, no embroidery, just a single straight line of thread running its length, a seam, not decorative, functional. It had been part of a dress, likely the train. Forensic stitchwork later confirmed it matched the back panel of the dress found under the tree at the venue. Someone had removed the last panel, kept it, folded it, then nailed it here. And when that seam was scanned under blacklight, they found a faint residue of powder. Not dirt, not ash. Makeup, pressed powder, flesh tone. The same kind worn by the bride during the wedding, meaning someone had rubbed the ribbon into her face, or held it near her skin, or used it to wipe something away, and that changed the tone of the sight entirely, because it wasn't just symbolic anymore. It wasn't just spatial, it was intimate, and it meant the person who had placed the final objects had been close enough to touch her. And maybe they had. Maybe that was the point. Maybe this was never about watching her vanish. Maybe it was about holding the edge of that moment in your hands forever, the second before she stepped away, before she turned, before the crowd noticed, before the photographer blinked, the breath right before something becomes real. And maybe they didn't want to control her. Maybe they just wanted to stay in that second with her, permanently. Because when the psychologist on site was asked to assess the layout, she didn't use the word shrine. She used the word loop, not a place of mourning, a place of re-entry, like something had been paused and was now being resumed. And that would explain the time gaps, the messages, the slow placement of items, the waiting, the quietness. Someone wasn't just remembering, they were pacing, and pacing is a form of rehearsal, and now they were here, not present, but ahead. Whoever left the stones knew exactly where to go, which step to take next. And the part that no one spoke aloud was that the last stone hadn't been used, and neither had the last panel. And maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for her to return and finish it. But if that was the case, the question became even harder. Where had she been? And why hadn't she come back? Because now the investigation didn't know which direction it was facing. Were they walking into a past event being mirrored? Or were they being led into something ongoing, and the air started to change again? Not the temperature, the light. The shadows started to feel taller, narrower, less random. The trees cast lines that felt like doorways, like someone had tried to build something inside them, and a theory began to take shape. Not official, not documented, just whispered between the team, that maybe someone had walked her out of the venue, into the woods, down a path, and told her not to turn around. Not because of danger, because of memory, because turning might break the moment. And maybe she didn't. Maybe she followed every instruction. Maybe she walked the whole trail like it was choreographed, and someone followed behind her, marking each place where she stood, collecting the air around her, pressing the memory into the soil so it could be walked again later. And the phrase "stay in frame" wasn't a rule for a photograph, it was a rule for a person, a way to keep her inside that last version of herself. Bride, not woman, not person, bride, forever. And that's when one of the texts said something that stopped everyone. What if the person doing this was never trying to keep her from vanishing? What if they were trying to make her vanish the right way? What if the real crime wasn't that she was taken? It was that she left imperfectly. And now, someone was correcting it, fixing it, repairing the image, not to help, not to confess, to complete the scene, because no one disappears cleanly, but she did. And maybe that was the plan all along. Not death, not captivity, stillness, total, permanent, irreversible stillness, like a photograph that keeps blinking at the edge of memory. And maybe the final stone, the one not yet carved, was waiting for that. And maybe the last person to touch it wouldn't be her. It would be whoever had carried her memory this far, whoever still knew the sound of her breath. And maybe that person was already watching the investigators now, waiting to see if they understood the steps, waiting to see if anyone else would finish it. The next morning, the air around the clearing felt different. Not colder, not sharper, just watched, like the moment had stretched itself overnight, growing longer instead of fading. The ring of stones hadn't moved. The ribbon was still knotted to the rusted nail. The stool remained centered, but the path beyond the clearing felt more visible than before, like someone had cleared it in the dark, not trimmed it or marked it, just walked it again and again until the leaves bent with memory. And that became the focus. Not evidence, not theory, but repetition. Because every part of this was about pacing, the placement of fabric, the folding of lace, the symmetrical curve of the objects. It wasn't random. It was timed. Someone had been here before, and someone planned to return, and the investigative team realized they weren't just following a trail backward. They were walking forward into a design that hadn't finished building itself yet. The phrase "stay in frame" had started to echo through the team's language, not as an order, but as an anchor. It became the only rule they had, because the deeper they followed the trail, the more the case lost shape. There was no crime scene, no blood, no scream, no declared suspect. The woman who vanished had never cried out, never turned, never left behind a single disrupted moment. She just stepped out of the path and into the trees, and someone had followed the breath she left behind. And now that breath had become ritual, the next marker came 30 yards past the stone ring, a piece of tulle tied between two thin branches, not like a flag, not like a veil, like a curtain. A translucent square held slightly above eye level, rippling in the breeze, casting a pale flicker across the dirt. And when the team stepped close, they found it was stitched along the bottom. Not words, not symbols, just lines. 11 of them. Tiny white threads, each 3 inches long, arranged like tally marks, but with no rhythm. The distance between them varied. The threads frayed differently. They weren't decorative. They were measures. And when the tech team charted the gaps, they realized the spacing matched the timing of camera shutters. Specifically, the delay between the last 8 photos taken during the bride's solo session. The sound cues from the photographer's audio files still existed. Someone had memorized them, not just the sequence, the rhythm, and stitched it into fabric, a breath map, a time code, printed in thread. And the worst part, the tally mark stopped at 11. Her last photo was number 12. Someone had left the final beat blank. The curtain rippled slightly in the breeze, making the light behind it dance across the ground, and the ground beneath it had been swept. Again, softly, like someone didn't want to erase the dirt, just smooth it, like a stage. And when one of the investigators stepped into the light of the curtain, the shadow it cast on the ground aligned perfectly with the footprint radius of her last known stance, exactly 5'5", the height listed on her license. Someone had rebuilt the posture using wind and thread, and above the curtain, pinned to the tree bark behind the branch, a strip of paper, aged, torn, printed with 3 words in faded serif font, cut from a program, the kind handed out at weddings. It read, "Please remain standing," and that phrase sent everyone quiet, because it wasn't about a bride. It was about a guest, about the people who had stayed behind. And for the first time, the investigation felt reversed, not into what happened to her, but into what she had been made to represent: the perfect disappearance. And the ritual around it wasn't about remembrance. It was about control. The fabric, the stool, the markers, they weren't signs of grief. They were symbols of ownership. Like someone had learned how to pause a person, how to stitch her into a frame and make the memory repeat itself until the people around it stopped trying to explain it and just watched. And that became the theory the team started writing in private notes, that the disappearance wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't panicked. It was performed. And someone had built an entire system around how to preserve that performance without the performer. And that's what they were chasing now. Not a killer, not a stalker, a preservationist, someone who didn't want her to be found, not because they wanted her gone, because they wanted her perfect. And perfect meant still. Still dress, still ribbon, still lace, still expression, and now, still ritual. The trail beyond the curtain grew narrower. The trees leaned in, and someone noticed that the shape of the branches began to reflect her dress. The tulle curve, the taper at the knees, the slope of the neckline. Not exact, not symmetrical, but suggestive. And someone had marked one tree by peeling back the bark in a perfect crescent, and on the exposed wood underneath, not carved, not painted, pressed faintly with ink and moisture, the outline of a hand. Not a full palm, not fingers, just the heel of the hand, the curve of the wrist, as if someone had leaned there, not recently, years ago. The pressure had left a bruise in the tree's memory, and now the bark had grown around it. No one spoke for a long time, because it no longer felt like they were walking a trail. It felt like they were being walked back through something that had already ended, and the fear wasn't that she had vanished. The fear was that this was the version of her someone wanted the world to remember, not a person, not a bride, not a woman, a freeze frame, a silhouette. And maybe that was the reason she never turned around, because someone asked her not to, because someone told her that as long as she stayed in frame, she would stay perfect. And maybe for 31 years, she did. The trail beyond the curtain narrowed into something that didn't feel like a path anymore, but an aisle, a corridor of trees that leaned inward just enough to make the air feel taller, the silence feel arranged, and the dirt beneath their feet smooth like fabric pressed down by decades of footsteps that never stepped out of line. They weren't walking into the woods. They were walking towards something that had already been waiting, and whatever it was, it hadn't needed sound or signs to leave its presence behind. It had left rhythm, the way the branches hung at uniform angles, the way the moss curved around stones as if avoiding invisible obstacles, the way the sunlight filtered in strips, not beams, casting lines across the floor like an unlit stage, lines that crossed at perfect 30-degree angles, matching the width of her veil as measured from her final photograph. The team slowed, not because they were scared, but because movement felt invasive. The deeper they went, the more the terrain felt rehearsed, and every step risked disrupting something older than the memory they were chasing. 22 steps past the curtain, they found the next object, not hanging, not buried, upright. A mirror, full-length, bridal style, cracked at the top left corner, resting against a tree like it had always belonged there. The glass was dulled from exposure, but still reflective. The frame was ornate, faded gold, the kind rented by wedding venues in the early 90s for photo booths and dressing rooms. This one had a tag etched into the wood near the base, barely legible. It matched the inventory log from the venue's original supplier, meaning this was one of the actual mirrors from her wedding day, but it hadn't been seen in years. It was never recovered when the venue changed hands. It had never been sold. It had vanished until now, and the way it sat there, angled slightly inward toward the path, not fully centered but turned just enough to catch the light from the last strip of sky, made it feel less like a forgotten item and more like a checkpoint. Like a moment someone had waited to recreate for 31 years. And when the team looked into the glass, they didn't see themselves clearly. The surface was fogged, the crack refracted their shape, but the frame around the reflection cast a familiar edge, not decorative, familiar. It matched the edge of the mirror captured in the background of one of her final preparation photos, a behind-the-scenes shot in the dressing suite. Meaning this was the same object, meaning someone had taken it that day or shortly after, meaning someone had saved it, kept it, preserved it, not for sentiment, for placement, and written faintly across the fog surface in what appeared to be oil or wax, a phrase, 5 words, reversed because it had been written from behind the glass, but when mirrored it read, "Walk backwards, do not look," and that confirmed it. This wasn't a trail, it was choreography. Someone had scripted the ritual of her disappearance not as an escape, not as a killing, but as an offering, a perfect loop in which she followed instructions and vanished without breaking frame. And the mirror wasn't to check her reflection, it was to make sure she didn't turn around, to trap her in that last profile, soft jawline, straight posture, bouquet in hand, and the mirror had captured something else. When the surface was photographed under deep exposure, an outline appeared in the fog, not drawn, not pressed, but left behind by contact. A shoulder, left, faint, as if someone had leaned into the glass with their back turned, not facing it, facing away. The size, height, angle, all matched her. Someone had made her stand there, or she had done it herself. But it wasn't a glance, it wasn't a pose, it was a placement, and beneath the mirror, tucked barely into the root of the tree, was the next marker, a guest card, the kind placed at wedding tables to assign seating, yellowed, creased, printed in thin cursive font. It read, Table 9, and on the back, written by hand, in the same flower-based ink used in the veil embroidery, the name Bride. No other names, no guests, just a title. And suddenly the scope of it widened. This wasn't just about her, this was about the room around her. Someone had recreated the roles of the day, reduced them to props, veil, comb, stool sash, mirror, place card, and left her trapped in the center of a memory she could never exit. Not because she was dead, because someone had chosen to keep her perfect, and perfection meant repeating the frame again and again until everyone watching forgot she was real. And now the mirror marked the midpoint, the halfway mark in the ritual, the part where the person, the bride, would pause, face away, and choose, not to turn. And that's what haunted the team most, the realization that nothing violent had happened. There had been no resistance, no fight, just a surrender to stillness, and someone had found a way to rehearse that stillness for decades without it fading. The trail past the mirror curved again, left like a spiral, and the next markers would be deeper, closer, and whatever waited at the end of the path would not be a person. It would be the place where the final frame was supposed to land, the place she was meant to disappear from. Not a grave. A finish line, a curtain drop, and someone had already marked it. They just hadn't revealed it yet. Beyond the mirror, the trail dipped slightly, not from erosion, not from wear, but from intention, like someone had pressed the earth downward at a slant to make the next movement slower, quieter, more deliberate. It wasn't a descent into darkness, it was a descent into pause. Even the trees changed shape. They arched overhead in a curve that didn't quite meet but felt like a hallway roof, with light threading through in a lattice pattern that resembled tulle pulled across a window. One of the texts said it reminded her of a veil being lifted. Another said it looked like the inside of a chapel aisle, but no one spoke above a whisper. And when they reached the bottom of the dip, they stopped because the ritual had shifted again. There was no object this time. No comb, no cloth, no fabric. There was a doorway, not to a building, to nothing. 2 wooden columns, carved, cracked at the edges, sunk 4 inches into the ground and topped with a crossbeam made of the same bridal mirror frame material. Soft gold, chipped, but polished. Someone had built an arch, not full-sized, not wedding scale, just large enough for one person to pass through without bending. And on the inside edge of the right post, etched faintly, the words, "Last steps." Not a phrase, a stage direction, and the air was still, not heavy, held, the same way it feels just before music cues, just before curtains part. And this wasn't a ruin, it was recent. The wood still smelled of pine, the nails still bright. No spiderwebs, no moss, no rot. Someone had built it this year. Someone had waited 3 decades, collected every piece of her that went missing, and built her exit from memory. And the idea that followed was colder than the discovery itself. This wasn't for investigators. This was for her, the one who vanished. Someone had built this to bring her back, and not in a spiritual way, in a ritualistic way, because everything from the veil to the stool to the placement of the shoes pointed in one direction, forward into this arch, into the slope beyond it. And when they passed under the beam, they saw what waited at the end of the trail. A chair, white, wooden, small, not bridal, childlike, the kind found in vintage dressing rooms for flower girls or makeup assistants. Too small for an adult to sit in, and that's what made it so disturbing. Because it meant she was never meant to sit. She was meant to kneel, to lower, to bow. The cloth beneath the chair had been pressed flat, not folded, ironed, still stiff from starch. A small embroidered corner showed a familiar pattern, the hem of her original dressing suite robe. Someone had cut it, preserved it, placed it here. And beside the chair, 2 things, a box and a frame. The box was lacquered white, simple, no handle, no lock. Inside, nothing, just a velvet lining with an indent the exact size and shape of a ring box, empty. And beside it, the photo. Not the final wedding picture, not the one taken on the stone path, a different one, earlier, captured by a guest, candid. She's smiling, looking over her shoulder, in motion, slightly blurred. The first moment she stepped into the aisle. The first glimpse anyone had of her that day. And someone had folded that photo 3 times, then unfolded it, then pinned it to the tree behind the chair. And when viewed from the mirror at the top of the slope, the photo aligned perfectly between the 2 branches, as if meant to appear like a real person waiting there. And that confirmed it. Someone had rehearsed this, not once, not loosely, precisely. And now the chair was the center of the performance, the end, the spot where she would have stopped, where she would have lowered herself, where the frame would hold, and someone had built this like a film set, like a memory chamber, not for an audience, for repetition. And the box, the photo, the chair, all of it was untouched by weather, fresh, placed recently, meaning the person building this had been here within the past week, meaning they were still pacing it, meaning they were still expecting it to work, and maybe it already had. Maybe this wasn't meant to recreate her vanishing. Maybe it was meant to trap her return, and the idea that followed was simple but unbearable. What if she did come back? What if that was the point? To give her one path home so she could vanish properly this time, with the right angle, the right lace, the right light. And what if all this time someone hadn't been chasing her memory, but her presence? What if they believed they could walk her back through the exact steps and make her reappear, as if she'd never stepped out of the frame at all? And what would that kind of person do if she didn't come back? If the ritual didn't work? If the final chair remained empty? The answer was already written in the dirt, because beneath the box, half buried, was a second place card. Same style, same yellowing, but this one had a name written in flower-based ink, not bride. It read replacement, and it was blank on the other side, waiting for a name to be filled in. And that meant the ritual wasn't just memory, it was substitution. And if the original never returned, the builder wouldn't stop. They would find someone who fit the frame. And maybe they already had. The moment they found the place card labeled replacement, the investigation shifted from recovery to prevention, because suddenly it wasn't about finding a woman who vanished 3 decades ago, it was about stopping someone who believed they could bring her back by using someone else, someone new, someone who didn't know they'd been chosen yet. The chair, the robe cloth, the empty box, none of it was about memory anymore. It was about staging. And the idea that this ritual had a contingency plan meant that it had never been spontaneous to begin with. It had always included failure, had always made room for a second version of her, as if she were a role being cast rather than a human being who had once walked out of frame and never returned. And that realization unsettled everyone on the team, because it meant they were behind something, chasing someone who wasn't improvising but following a pattern that had been planned for decades. They collected the items from the final site with surgical care, photographing every angle of the chair, the box, the pinholes in the photo, and the print bleed in the place card. And when they returned to the station to catalog it all, a new discovery made things worse. The original wedding guest list, once thought to be incomplete, had a back page, handwritten by the bride herself, noting specific seating details, names, and relationships, and at the bottom, 2 rows of scratched out entries, people who RSVP'd late or never showed. And among those names, in the final margin, was a notation in the corner: